Okay, it says I'm live. Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. I'm doing this with a new computer. It's been a month or so since I've done this, so let me know if everything's coming out okay. Um, Let me know in the comments. Today we're going to be discussing the balloon panic. In the week leading up to Saturday, February 4th, 2023, the U.S. political scene went into a conniption fit over a Chinese surveillance balloon that was traveling over the United States. On Saturday, February 4th, the U.S. government eventually shot it down. But I think this phenomenon, this event, is going to have longer term ramifications that are worth considering and considering critically. I think the approach of most people who read the news to this was largely amusement. Oh, isn't it funny watching US politicians and US media sources go nuts over this balloon thing? Ha ha ha. Isn't it crazy, the madness of crowds, or what have you? I don't think it's particularly funny. I actually think it's quite sad. I think that it is an indicator of the way things are going, and that it's going to actually have a lot of negative effects, both in broader geopolitics, the US China relationship, but also in just the intricacies of how civil aviation works everywhere. I'm not an expert on those topics, but I have done a bit of research, and I think it's worth diving in on how this new Cold War and this new realm of the Cold War is going to end up working, is going to end up impacting things negatively. I'm getting weird warning signs on my streaming system. Let me know if that's coming through okay. Yeah. Anyway, so let's talk. Before we do this, some preliminaries. You may notice that Logo Cool Extreme has or maybe it's only in my view, that he's got a wrench next to his name. He is the moderator. If you're new to this, we've got a live stream going. You're encouraged to participate. You're encouraged to participate vociferously. You can say anything you want about politics. You can say anything you want about me. Feel free to insult what I'm saying, insult how I look, insult my haircut, what have you. What we do ask is that you be civil to each other in the chat, and that you not disrupt the quality of the chat by repeatedly posting similar things. Loga is the moderator, Logo Cool Extreme. If you are doing something he does not like, he will warn you. And if you continue to persist in that behavior, he will then ban you for all time. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. Do as he says to make this a more pleasant environment for everyone who is interacting. I would also say that please hold off on any questions for me until I've finished the first part of my presentation. The presentation can go as short as 20 minutes. Sometimes it's as long as an hour. Depends on how my talking about stuff goes. And then we'll do at least an hour of question and answers afterwards. And that will be your opportunity to ask questions directly to me about the topic of today's presentation or anything you want to talk about. And also, if you want to donate to keep this channel going, the super chats are very much appreciated as well. So yes, the balloon, the China balloon. I think what I want to talk about here up front, and I think is a crucial distinction that not a lot of people are making, is the fact that the United States is entirely within its rights to shoot down a Chinese surveillance balloon over its territory. Any country is entirely within its rights to shoot down entities that are violating their airspace. I was just reading, there's a sort of interesting distinction, like if this were a manned spy plane, then maybe there'd be different considerations around proportionality or something along those lines. But with an unmanned vehicle that is violating the airspace of another country, unequivocally, that country is in the right when they choose to shoot it down. I don't think there's any real dispute about that. The question, though, is the norms. The question is this, no question that the United States has the right to do this, but is it the smart thing to do, or the world peace enhancing thing to do to shoot it down? Or does it set precedents and create potential problems for the future? And I think that's definitely more where I lean. The analogy I was thinking of was, okay, well, in a lot of US states, or maybe just a few, I'm not too sure about the distinction between personal property like a house and a property, but I believe that in a lot of US states, you are completely within your rights to shoot somebody who comes to shoot somebody who comes onto your property. But say there's a shortcut through your property to a swimming hole and you've always been fine with it, you may be completely within your rights to shoot the neighbor kids when they want to cut through your property to get to the swimming hole. You could be completely within your legal rights to do that, but it would still be the wrong thing to do, because obviously your neighbor would get angry if you shot their kids, and you would create some kind of feud or legal problems. So that's the key distinction here. Like, it can be completely legally right and appropriate, completely legally right for somebody to do something, but not the right thing to do. And I think that's kind of where we are with this balloon thing, with the surveillance challenging. I'm not saying that China should just be able to do these balloon overflights whenever they want. I'm not even saying that necessarily shooting it down was the wrong thing. What was the wrong thing was the absolutely ignorant panic that the country fell into in the run-up and aftermath of this shooting. There was no adult in the room outside of a few folks on Twitter pointing out, like, okay, hey, we don't need to be so crazy about this. Even if it was the appropriate step to shoot down this balloon, we didn't need to fall into this position where we're sort of pretending that China is somehow stealing our vital national fluids, or poisoning us, or about to do an EMP from this frickin' balloon. And I didn't see any adults in the room. I actually saw a lot of people in the room looking to make things worse. And crucially, this wasn't just media actors looking to create panic. This was members of the US government using this as an opportunity to further their agendas and make things worse in some fairly unsubtle ways. The most clear and obvious example of this has got to be the smorgasbord of unexplained shoot downs that I think it's the US, regardless, it's Northcom. I don't know what elements are being used in particular, but US and Canadian fighter jets have been going on a rampage against most probably completely harmless stuff. We've got, on February 10th, we had a cylindrical-like object being shot down in Alaska. On February 11th, we had another cylindrical-like object being shot down over Canada. And then over Lake Huron, this is, I guess, scrambled from Michigan, on February 12th, we had another unidentified object that has been described in a variety of sources in a variety of ways. It's either an octagonal shape with strings coming off of it, or it's entirely possible that it's just a collection of balloons, not just civilian balloons, but it's entirely possible that it's just a bundle of, like, birthday party balloons that floated up pretty high and expanded because it went up to that height, that we spent, I don't know how many millions of dollars shooting down. So what we have here is a US military and a Canadian military that is using an environment of fear and shock to go use incredibly expensive assets to shoot down a whole bunch of stuff that we don't understand or may not be entirely harmless. I don't expect that to change. I think that this China balloon controversy was big enough, was large enough, that we're going to see a new sort of set of operating procedures be instantiated. We're going to have all kinds of restrictions on the usage of airspace for balloons, for science, for civilian uses, what have you. Everything's going to get a little harder and a little more heavily regulated now, in part because people are going to be terrified of the idea of their weather experiment I think the kinds of objects we're talking about, it's unlikely. I mean, they're in a different class of objects than like actual civilian balloon uses, like balloons that have people in them or what have you. But people are now going to have to deal with much heavier regulatory infrastructure around anything that they may want to do. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, whatever the Canadian equivalents are for this, and individual states all have their own approaches to the regulating of airspaces and what you can do with drones, what you can do with balloons, what you can do with this, that, and the other thing. But almost all of them have conceded that outside of certain areas, outside of certain high traffic areas around cities, suburbs, what have you, airports, you've largely been allowed to do whatever you want and not have to tell anybody about it. That overstates the current state of regulation in the United States, but it's much freer, out in the middle of nowhere, like, oh, I don't know, the Yukon in Canada or Alaska. People could just do stuff. And now, that's going to stop being the case. You're going to have to tell the government about everything you do. There's already a range of laws that are new on the books, just coming into force, talking about how you have to report the usage of drones, the systems, the government systems you have to be locked into to use drones. Some of these things could be good. Like, I'm not saying it's a good thing that we typically have abandoned or completely non-noticed balloons floating over beautiful nature preserves in Canada and Alaska. That's not necessarily a good thing. Maybe there is a real environmental cost there that's worth examining with regulation. I do know that we don't fucking need to be scrambling, multi-million dollar missions worth of F-22s to go shoot down every weather balloon or surprisingly long-lived eighth birthday party balloon or a bunch of birthday party balloons. It does seem really plausible. That's what the Michigan thing could have been. I'm not saying that's definitely what it was, but it really could have been like 8 birthday party balloons that just got away. So the idea that we're going to be scrambling F-22s to deal with this every time strikes me as not the right approach. So I think, it's important to mention there's actually a not particularly terrible Noah Smith article, despite his usual framing of, oh, this is the real Cold War and we need to, be super scared about that. Just pointing out that we're in this incredibly complex realm of innovation around the skies in the United States and around the world. You can call it a speciation or a Cambrian explosion, just a vast, after it seems like a century of largely knowing what planes were and what planes were going to be up there within the limitation of a few formats. We have all kinds of different things coming on the market, different kinds of drones, balloons can be involved in that too, all kinds of crazy like garage innovation going on around stuff. And that can be scary, that can be problematic, but it's also tremendously promising, this idea of a sort of return to Wright brothers style innovation in the garage. It's very cool, and this panic around the China balloon, I think, will go some way towards shutting that down. The securitization of all U.S. laws and regulations is a really established dynamic since 9/11, and this China balloon panic will push that forward. To talk about just the distinction between what is allowed and what the level of violence that should be applied, I think it's worth talking about the Hainan Island incident. This is back in 2001. I remember this clearly. This was a huge deal. This was an international incident, even though I guess in April 2001, I was 21 years old and a lot more interested in drinking than following international politics. I remember hearing discussion of this on Jon Stewart, watching The Daily Show or what have you. It was a very, very big deal. And what happened was a U.S. spy plane, according to Wikipedia, which I assume is the U.S. version, was 70 miles off of Hainan Island. Some people want to describe this as being deep in the South China Sea. It's like, no, it's 70 miles off of Hainan Island, which is a Chinese island that nobody disputes in any way is a Chinese island. If you are incensed about Chinese flights that violate the Taiwanese aerial defense interdiction zone, all those things we were supposed to be super angry about China violating Taiwanese airspace, but then you looked at the maps and it was, oh wait, that's hundreds of miles away. It's just in this interdiction zone. Like if aerial defense interdiction zones were a thing in 2001, then the United States, even the United States' story about this incident, the spy plane was in that space. And it seems like some Chinese fighter jets attempted to intercept this flight, and because they were probably not particularly talented flyers, one of them managed to actually fly into this spy plane, resulting in the deaths of the Chinese pilots, and the U.S. Plane filled with, I believe, something like 5, 10, maybe 12 U.S. soldiers had to land on Hainan Island, and it became a tremendous international problem for everybody. But eventually the Chinese and the Americans agreed on some face-saving statement for both sides, and these Americans all went home, despite the fact that their surveillance, their spying on China had killed a Chinese pilot. They were all sort of sent home happily. And it's just like, it's from a different world looking at the resolution of that, and it's a different world that I put in the title of this presentation, and it is the world of the Open Skies Treaty. Now, to be sure, China was not a signatory to any of these Open Skies treaties, but it's definitely worth focusing on. There's also a distinction here between Open Skies Agreements and the Open Skies Treaty. These are two different things, which gets a little confusing when you Google. Open Skies Agreements relate to the bilateral, and I think in some cases international relations between countries governing whose carriers can go there, if like you can Delta fly to China or stuff like that. That's very distinct from the Open Skies Treaty, which the Trump administration took the United States out of back in 2020. This was a incredibly positive post-Cold War innovation. This is the context within which, again, China was not a signatory, but this is the international context within which the Hainan incident happened. And what the basic principle of the 1992 Open Skies Treaty is between the United States, Russia, and a whole bunch of post-Soviet countries, and I believe other European countries. Did not look at the whole list of signatories. You can easily find that on Wikipedia. And what this agreement said was that, yeah, you can surveil. Feel free. You can definitely send unarmed surveillance planes over our entire territory at any time, and we'll do the same to you. And what this was a international confidence building measure. It was essentially saying that, yeah, I have nothing to hide, you have nothing to hide, we're pretty clear about what we have. And it just made for a safer and more secure world. That, of course, ended in 2020 when the Trump administration took the United States out of the Open Skies Treaty. Their justification for that was that there had been some Russian violations. I find that very easy to believe. Seems like looking at those violations, they were sort of like time limited, like we don't want you flying over our military exercise or what have you. Seems like a little bit more reasonable, and seems like maybe discarding this really, really positive 30-year-old pillar of international relations over those violations wasn't a good thing, but the Trump administration and John Bolton never met an international arms control treaty they didn't want to destroy. And, you know, that's what they did. So the Open Skies Treaty ended. But this was the context within which international relations operated for those 30 years. And yes, this was limited to Europe. This was limited to the United States and Russia. But as China rose further and further, there were assumptions that they could um, uh, they were operating in this system of international norms that was heavily influenced by the Open Skies Treaty. And I think the lack of punitiveness that China illustrated towards the American spy plane and the Hainan Island incident helps to illustrate that. Helps to illustrate how it just actually wasn't that big of a deal. Um, wasn't that big of a deal. Um, and I think this is the context within which China still thought it could operate with these surveillance balloons. My understanding is that these surveillance balloon overflights happened during the Trump administration. The Trump administration didn't choose to do anything. These do seem like super complex, super expensive balloons that China was putting together. That's like the very key distinction between what the United States government shot down on February 4th and the largely, stray 8th birthday party balloons that they were shooting down on February 10th, 11th, and 12th. I mean, this was a very complex, very heavy-duty surveillance set of surveillance apparatus. The Chinese government's claims that these were just weather balloons just strike me as pretty transparent nonsense, even considering the sources of most of our information. But in the context of the world of the 30 years between 1992 and 2020, it wasn't so out of the ordinary or so crazy. I think clearly the Chinese were pushing it by putting something like this into U.S. airspace. And I think the U.S. was, again, totally within its rights to shoot it down. But it also could have just been like, hey, we're not going to let this happen anymore. And that would have also been, I think, a way to do this without sparking. I mean, to be clear, China bears responsibility for the incredible panic in the United States that is going to make the world worse for everybody. But the United States would have been better if during the Trump administration, Trump had said to China, just don't, we see this, we know what you're doing, fucking cut it out and never do it again. Instead, we had a status quo where China thought it could get away with throwing these balloons over the United States, and then the United States shooting it down, making a big violent incident. I'm not sure if I'm making this distinction clear, what's important about this, but the fading away of that, sure, we all surveil everybody, we all surveil each other, it helps to build international trust. The fading away of that norm is really bad. The fading away of the norm where actually the United States is fairly relaxed about its airspace as long as you're not putting a balloon or a drone into the path of a airliner, that's a norm that's falling away. So the idea that, haha, isn't it funny, isn't it silly, this big panic over this balloon, I think that overlooks a lot of really, really serious shifts that we're seeing here. We're going to see a fall down in the possibilities for aviation innovation as a result of this. We're going to see a fall down in the possibilities of international norms around. It's just a collapse of international norms around everybody can surveil each other. It's fine. And this, of course, has really scary implications if we start getting out of airspace and into space. Obviously, and this was really obvious, this is one of the reasons why most savvy people were kind of laughing at this whole controversy, is that I think it's fairly openly acknowledged, or at least it's a very known thing, that both the United States and China have spy satellites that observe each other's territories. So is China going to decide to shoot down a U.S. satellite because it just seems turnabout as fair play? I think that's pretty unlikely. But because the U.S. military and U.S. politicians have had such luck and made such hay and had such political freedom to create panic over the balloons, it strikes me as very likely that at some point, probably some point of higher tension, China will, do something else that can be construed as aggressive, and in return, the United States will shoot down a bunch of Chinese spy satellites. And that's obviously one of the worst things that China has ever done. Was, this probably a decade ago at this point, they did some proof of concept where they blew up one of their own satellites, and risked ending humanity's access to the stars. So, of course, if the United States were to start blowing up Chinese satellites, the New York Times and the Washington Post would tell us that they'd do so in a much more careful way to make sure that they didn't create an expanding debris field in orbit that blocked humanity's access to space. But then when China retaliated to our blowing up their satellites, they probably wouldn't do that either. They wouldn't be able to make those sorts of guarantees. So yeah, it's just a general fall down in the level of international relations, that less the actual shooting down of the balloon itself. Again, the U.S. is entirely in its rights to do that, but just the panic around it and the incredible jacking up of U.S. military activity around balloons, around space stuff, not space stuff, aerospace, the country's airspace. It's going to be bad for international relations. It's going to be bad for aviation innovation. That's the main presentation I wanted to make, that there's two things that I should mention. No, it's not UFOs. We are not seeing the United States shooting down, going to war against the aliens. I think what we are seeing here is a really interesting dynamic in U.S. messaging, Pentagon messaging, U.S. government messaging about the possibility of aliens. Throughout the Cold War, the United States government was very eager to, because back then there was an appreciation that really the world was constantly on the brink of nuclear annihilation over the United States and Russia's competition with nuclear missiles. So the United States back then was much more interested in calming people down. They were much more interested in preserving the idea that they had complete consciousness of what was in the sky, and the U.S. public didn't need to worry about this sort of UFO nonsense. So certainly throughout the Cold War and culturally, institutionally, I think for a few decades thereafter, the United States government, whenever it saw something it couldn't explain, would be very clear to say, "Oh no, that's totally explainable. I don't know what you're talking about. That videotape is ridiculous. No. There's nothing unexplainable. Blah 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 blah." Now, post 9/11, especially post the fading of the terrorism cash cow, the United States is desperately looking, and especially now that to really dominate in Ukraine, makes them look much weaker than we had thought. China's stubborn refusal to start a war over Taiwan with the United States, the way the U.S. military has been desperately pushing them to do for decades, it means that the Pentagon needs other excuses to keep the budgets up. So now, when something unexplained happens, it's entirely in the Pentagon's interests to say, we don't know what it was. We won't say that it could be aliens, but we're not saying that it's not aliens. Because now the main point of a lot of the messaging of the Pentagon and the U.S. government more generally is to get the U.S. public scared. So that's where this incredible switch from the U.S. government from being like, no, aliens, that's ridiculous. There's nothing to it. There's no aliens. Don't be silly. And everything unexplained is completely explainable. Don't be silly. Now they've switched because they're looking for more reasons to spend money and jack up their budget. So, gee, I don't know. Maybe this was aliens. Maybe these bunch of 8th birthday party balloons were really UFOs. And yeah, it's just, it's really irresponsible. But I think that's the main dynamic that we're seeing in the wait, did the U.S. government just say it could have been UFOs? Is the U.S. government now admitting that aliens are real? They're not. It's simply it's a switch in messaging profile from trying to keep the U.S. public calm in the context of the Cold War when everybody was very rationally interested and concerned about nuclear annihilation to the modern era where the Pentagon just wants to keep people as scared as possible. As far as are there UFOs? Are there aliens? I completely believe that there could be alien intelligence. That the idea that the humans are alone in the world, in the universe, seems incredibly arrogant and incredibly unlikely. But I do not go from that to the fact that, oh, the U.S. government or the Navy or some fighter pilot saw something he didn't understand, to the jump from there to, well, the aliens have visited. They're visiting now. They're here now. I've never made that jump, and I don't think that jump makes much sense. I think the fact is, and this is probably one of the the absolutely central aspects of my approach to things, like the bare bones of my philosophy, is that we don't understand a goddamn thing. This is the way I think about economics. I think most economics, most of what the Federal Reserve is doing is like, 16th century medicine. Like, we have no idea what we're doing. We have a few things that might work. We have no idea. Like, back then we had no idea how the human body works. We still don't have a complete idea of how the human body works. We have no idea how the economy works. And this expands to the physical realm as well, where, because we've got cars and planes and railroads. We like to believe that we've tamed nature. We understand what it is. Like, airspace is this incredible volume of space, constantly bombarded by radiation from all over the universe, incredibly dependent on weather that we do not understand, climate that we do not understand, air patterns that we do not fully understand. I would wager that if a fighter pilot spent 8 hours in the air focused on just looking at stuff instead of, and I don't think they don't spend 8 hours in the air at a time, do they? But they spent 2 hours in the air just looking around for weird stuff instead of focusing on the complexities of operating their machine or their machine or their mission. I think if they just spent 2 hours looking around, they'd see a UFO every time they went into the air. They'd see something strange that we don't fully understand, something that is outside of their experience or outside of what we would scientifically expect to see. Like, I don't think aliens are visiting. I certainly don't think we're shooting down alien objects, as we see with these February 10th, February 11th, February 12th. What I do think is that there's vastly more in a 2-hour fighter jet pilot's flight that we don't understand, that we don't want to admit we don't understand. So I think that, yes, I don't think anybody's lying about seeing stuff they don't understand or don't explain. I don't think it's, I think probably, 5 to 10 to 50 to 80% of that could be Soviet or Chinese stuff that's unexplained. Or, or it could just all be artifacts of the 12th, the 12th birthday parties, bundles of balloons that flew too high. We just don't understand much at all. If the U.S. government is finally admitting that they don't understand some of the things that they see, the jump from there to it's aliens doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So, yeah, that's on UFOs. On a conspiracy theory that I do kind of believe, and I usually tend to be very, very against conspiracy theories, about the timing of the China balloon, I think is worth talking about here. It is really, really convenient, the timing of this panic in the United States. It could really be what we really could have seen a serious act of sabotage on the part of hardliners in the Chinese government or the U.S. government. It is just a fact, a lot of people want to avoid this, that China over the past couple months has realized how badly they screwed up with the whole Donald Trump opportunity. Basically, Donald Trump I've called him China's biggest opportunity since Pearl Harbor. In Pearl Harbor, Japan was invading China, had been for 4 or 5 years, then decided to destroy Pearl Harbor, bringing in the United States on China's side. What Donald Trump represented was an incredible opportunity for China to curry favor with the rest of the developed world, Europe, China, and of course the global south as well, and present itself as the friendly hegemon, like, oh gosh, look at this crazy America. Couldn't we be better and nicer? Instead, I think probably largely because of face issues, the need to preserve the prestige of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, against a nationalist populace that they had worked a lot to create, of course. But I think largely because of domestic political reasons, instead of reacting to Donald Trump as the adults in the room, the Chinese government decided to react with wolf warrior politics, being like, oh, Trump's going to be arrogant and shitty. We can be even more arrogant and shitty. And that was, of course, a tremendously bad move by the Chinese government. They failed miserably, in fact, to impress anybody with that. And they actually managed to put a lot more momentum behind a variety of anti-Chinese U.S. policies that had been being workshopped since the second Obama term, the Obama administration. So China has realized they really, really, really fucked up. Last November, Xi Jinping met with Joe Biden. This was the first meeting. So yeah, this would have been almost towards the end of Biden's second year as U.S. president. It was the first meeting between the Chinese and U.S. leaders. A lot of backslapping and friendliness and smiling and this, that, and the other thing. And what was supposed to put meat on the bones of this sort of reopening was a meeting between Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, and a bunch of Chinese, whatever the Chinese counterpart is. In very exciting news, the week of, well, I guess the week that ended February 4th, I think it was February 2nd or February 3rd, it was revealed that Xi Jinping himself, the leader of China, was actually going to deign to visit and hang out with, not hang out with, but was actually going to grant an audience to this much lower U.S. official, the Secretary of State. And it was seen as a sign of the seriousness of China's attempts to resolve some problems, to get back on board, to fully discard the wolf warrior stuff. It was this attempt to move forward. This was happening. We got this news that Xi Jinping was going to meet with Blinken as the United States was descending or ascending into the height of its China furor, anti-China balloon furor. So yeah, this was something that became, because of that political furor, untenable. It became something that Blinken simply could not do. So we had a massive, massive crisis at exactly the time that was necessary to completely derail the most hopeful meeting or progress between the United States and China. You know, the attempt to sort of move beyond the Trump years. And I don't actually blame Blinken or the Biden administration for canceling this meeting. They had no choice. They simply had no choice but to do so. But what I do think is that the timing here is incredibly convenient. And there doesn't need to be any really convoluted reasoning behind this. If you want to say that, okay, U.S. hardliners sabotaged this, you just look at, well, you know, they knew in some arenas of the general foreign policy establishment or the U.S. military, they knew that China was doing these spy balloons. We know that there were at least 3 overflights during the Trump administration. These elements could have seen, while Blinken's going to China, we really don't want, and it looks like China's wimping out and trying to, you know, do more peace stuff. We really don't want that to happen. So, hey, look at this. There's that balloon that's flying over again. Let's get it. Let's leak this news. Let's let my buddy with a telescope in Montana know that it's up there, and he'll look at it, and then we'll get the news in there, and boom, meeting's not happening. I think that's plausible. I think it's equally plausible that Xi Jinping had no idea, or even, you know, a couple layers down, had no idea that this surveillance overflight was ongoing this week. And a bunch of people in power in China said, well, let's let it go, and let's also, you know, maybe make it a little bit lower over Montana so somebody sees it. That's also very plausible to me. I don't think the U.S. government didn't invent this balloon, or like the But there's a lot of very plausible possibilities here where I think Chinese or American hardliners could have put their thumb on the scales to disrupt Blinken's meeting. I think that strikes me as credible. That strikes me as something that probably happened, or maybe it didn't. Maybe it was all a complete coincidence. That's also very possible. But yeah, I kind of doubt it. So that's the presentation. I am done in 40 minutes in regular time. That's what I wanted to say about the China balloon and the end of open skies. It is now time for Q&A, and we'll do that for an hour and 20 minutes, or maybe a little less, because I think my bladder is already limiting that. 50 viewers, alien cell. I'm not sure 50 is that high, Scott, but regardless, I'm delighted that 50 folks are here. We can talk more about aliens if you want. The Attack Titan at Mo Freedom Foundation. What's your take on Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and other institutions? Aren't they just a cog in the U.S. empire? No, they're not just a cog in the U.S. empire. I think it's a mistake to entirely discount an institution because it acts in some ways, in some instances, in service to the United States. I think these institutions are tremendously complex and large things. And they can serve a number of agendas at any time. Like Russia Today would be an example that of definitely a wing of the U.S. government, of the Russian government, a propaganda outfit that also did good work occasionally. Obviously, it would lie and distort things if it were dealing with anything that was that implicated the interests of the Russian government. And I don't think that actually it's probably unfair to compare Human Rights Watch or the Amnesty International to elements of Russia to Russia Today, because I think that actually they are much more legitimate than Russia Today. There are absolutely instances where Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have acted in ways, or just particular products of Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International have been weaponized by the U.S. government. I believe that I'm sure there's definitely some mismatch. I'm sure that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch probably do put more resources to focus on Iran or focus on Russia or focus on China than they do on Saudi Arabia or Israel. Well, I know that Human Rights Watch in particular, that's what was his name? The guy who led that for years, who just got snubbed by the Harvard Business School. The Human Rights Watch, I believe, put out work products calling Israel an apartheid state. I mean, that's obvious. That's an unavoidable conclusion, but that is not in service to U.S. empire. I think that it's valuable that the world has organizations like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. Heck, I even think it's valuable. I think that we probably went a little too far in cracking down on Russia Today. Al Jazeera is an institution that will never go against the interests of the Qatari ruling family, but it'll be critical of everybody else in the region and everybody else in the world. So it provides real value. You have to understand that, yes, a U.S.-funded organization or a Western-focused organization is going to have prejudices, not even necessarily conscious prejudices, but it's going to have prejudices that make it more likely to go after the enemies of the United States, the perceived enemies of the United States. It is, in some cases, these organizations can be infiltrated by the CIA, or it doesn't have to be anything that nefarious. It could just be, the head of HRW, the head of Amnesty International, goes to Davos and has a couple drinks with the Secretary of State, and they decide they see things in certain ways. Yes, they can be sinister. Yes, they can be manipulated. But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing to have organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International who are constantly on the lookout for governments that do evil things to people. That's a good thing, and you shouldn't just unequivocally dismiss these organizations. also, these organizations, and it varies from organization to organization, do have standards. Some of them, it's interesting that a lot of the China stuff about Xinjiang is based on one particularly out there, maybe a little unbalanced right wing guy working for a few right wing foundations. This is the more extreme stuff, talking about, oh yeah, Xinjiang's definitely a genocide, this, that, and the other thing. We know from the Chinese government that Xinjiang is troubling and terrifying. They admit to running concentration camps. Amnesty International, HRW, would put out much more carefully worded statements about this, about the obvious crimes against humanity that are being committed. But if the US government really wants to start talking about genocide, as I think they did a lot more officially during the Trump administration, then they've got to rely on more, the Jamestown Foundation, which occasionally does decent work, but is much less reliable. Or what's it, Zens or something? I can't remember some evangelical Christian who has decided to be the source of information on China genocide. And he's a lot less reliable. So, take each organization as it goes. You shouldn't believe anything. You shouldn't believe anything that I say uncritically. You shouldn't believe anything that anybody says uncritically. But the fact that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch exist, and that money and time is put into exposing crimes against humanity all over the world, even if it is leaning a little harder towards U.S. enemies, does not make them worthless, does not make them completely dismissible cogs in the U.S. empire, though I think you can fairly describe them as cogs in U.S. empire. Honestly, I see Vladimir Putin as a cog in U.S. empire, so I have different definitions. Joseph Belfort asks, what do you think about the future of Morocco? That's a great question. I have not done a deep dive on Morocco in years. I visited about, 3-4 years ago. I really loved it. Morocco's fascinating. It's obviously got an extraordinary tourism industry, but my understanding is that it's also becoming much more closely integrated with European manufacturing. It's got some natural resources that Europe needs. Was it phosphates or something, sort of fertilizer stuff? Also functions as a conduit for oil and gas from other places, though of course that's always problematic because of their relationship with Algeria. There's a lot that's positive about Morocco. I think the demographics are pretty good. I think that their political system is still kind of an absolute monarchy, but they've put many more of the pieces in place in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, many more of the pieces in place for a real functioning parliamentary system. I'm pretty anti-monarchy generally, but I do think that Morocco, more than any other country, more than any other Arab monarchy, has put, I'm not sure they're real yet, but it's put more of the elements of multi-party democracy together than any other country. Well, I don't know. Maybe it's competitive with Algeria in that. So I think there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful about Morocco. I have not done a really deep dive on Morocco, really ever. I will say that their potential conflict with Algeria is infuriating to me. I think that you can definitely argue that there have been periods where it's more Algeria's fault or it's more Morocco's fault, or maybe you can even argue, even for the sake of argument, let's say that it's all Algeria's fault and Algeria is just an incredible dumbass, and they're 99% of the problem in the Algerian-Morocco thing. Even if you grant that, it's really stupid for Morocco to have engaged in it at all. I think it's. I've made a video years ago talking about the world's dumbest conflict, and I think just that Morocco and Algeria, such natural, there's so much that they have, and obviously there's so much that they have that's different, but they have differences I don't know, like the Netherlands and Belgium have differences, whereas there's such scope for them to band together for mutual benefit against the Europeans, who have just used the Moroccan-Algeria conflict to 60 years of Morocco-Algeria conflict to better divide and conquer and exploit the resources of Northern Africa. It's just a tremendous screw-up. I mean, just the general cause of pan-Arab unity largely destroyed by when Algeria and Morocco. Jesus, Algeria and Morocco at this point are probably the first and second most powerful Arab countries. And yes, there's a lot of Amazigh, Berber, what have you. But yeah, no, I mean, no, actually, I think that's true. Algeria and Morocco are the most powerful Arab countries. That's just flatly true in terms of the amount of independence and the in terms of the amount of independence and the extraordinary, the resource bases they have, the industry such as it is. Like Morocco and Algeria are both vastly more serious countries than Egypt or Saudi Arabia or certainly Iraq or Syria at this point. And it's just an incredible tragedy that they've been fighting for so long. So yeah, that's what I want to say about that. But yeah, I think there's a lot of hope for Morocco, more hope than there is for Algeria, frankly, at this point. Thanks, Rob. Christopher Murtaugh has given me, wow, like $270 Mexican. Okay, I don't know how much that actually is, but regardless, I'm very grateful. Thanks, Rob. Hola desde Mexico. The big balloon was 60,000 feet, but others were lower in civilian airspace. Would the latter fall under less acceptable surveillance under the Treaty on Open Skies and be acceptable to shoot down? So the Treaty on Open Skies no longer exists, and China was never a signatory. I hope I didn't, I wasn't unclear about that. I think while the Treaty on Open Skies was going, and to be clear, like the Treaty on Open Skies was limited to unarmed planes. I guess the balloon was unarmed, but I think there was also like beyond that, there was like certification of the kinds of planes that were used. The overflights were open and I think even scheduled to a degree. I don't know about the details around that. So any unannounced part, balloon overflight could technically be shut down under the Treaty on Open Skies, but it wouldn't have been. And again, China was never a signatory to the Treaty on Open Skies. So yeah, like the minutia of that is confusing. I do think the thing about it being at 60,000 feet was it also just made it incredibly expensive and difficult to shoot down. I don't think, can the F-22s actually fly that high? Did I read something like that? Like they weren't, it was the missile that had to be shot up that high or something like that. I looked into it and there is a very key distinction by international and U.S. standards between space, aerospace and outer space. And the 60,000 feet that the China balloon was flying at was far, far below Chinese space, for sure. It was far, far, far below outer space. So there is a clear legal distinction between the satellites that fly over and surveil stuff and this balloon. It's nice to hear, so Christopher's moved from Canada to Mexico, is my understanding. That must be very exciting and much warmer. I was just in Puerto Rico for 2 weeks, which I love the people in the community down there, but the weather I do not love. So I don't think I would ever be able to move to Mexico, but it is definitely, for the majority of human beings that enjoy warm weather, I think that Mexico move must be pretty exciting. But yeah, the big balloon was 60,000, and the others were lower in civilian airspace. Would the latter fall under less acceptable surveillance? Yeah, so the Treaty on Open Skies did have a lot of qualifications and whatnot, but I think it's the general spirit of the Treaty on Open Skies that is fading away, and that is to be lamented, seriously lamented. I think that's a really sad and unpleasant transition. I don't think I emphasized that enough. So the Open Skies Treaty was not just between the U.S. and Russia. It was also between a bunch of post-Soviet states and I believe a bunch of other NATO states. So it also, this sort of return or I don't know, return, but this newly developing status quo where the U.S. and China are going to be much more mercilessly shooting stuff down. And I think China was either threatening to shoot stuff down or was actually shooting stuff down over its own airspace in recent weeks. Actually makes it a lot harder for the little guys. Because, the U.S. gets a little bit of assurance by being able to fly planes over Russia. But whoo boy, is that more important for the who boy is that more important for the Poles or the Hungarians or the Baltics, which I believe were allowed to fly. Maybe not the Baltics, but certainly the Polish were able, under the Open Skies Treaty, which Russia did pull out of after the U.S. pulled out of, I think about a year later, the Poles were allowed to do overflights of Russia. So yeah, it's that general, the little guys lose when China and the United States decides that nobody else can access their airspace, which is a shift that we are really seeing. Wow, so many super chats. I'm very grateful. What is your take on Lula's roundup of insurrectionists in his meeting with Biden, AOC, and Bernie? Also, his neutral take on the Ukraine war. I have read a little bit about the Brazilian government's approach to the insurrectionists who, the incredibly ineffectual insurrectionists who took over, was that January 8th? That they destroyed a variety of government buildings in Brasilia. It's sort of history repeating as farce. On January 6th, 2021, there was actually an ongoing certification of the U.S. presidential election that the protesters disrupted. There was nothing of the kind going on for the January 8th people. They really were just a bunch of clownish thugs. I initially, and continue to be, pretty pleased that those clownish thugs were arrested and processed, seem to be being arrested and processed more quickly than was the case in the United States. I was even more pleased to see that some of the security officials were suffering real consequences. It does appear folks that I do trust to a degree on Brazil have sounded the alarm about this. Like Glenn Greenwald, I know he's not a particularly popular character. Even I have sort of fallen out of support for him in recent months. But no doubt a very important journalist on the Brazilian and American scenes, have pointed out that under a Brazilian judge who is perceived as being more sympathetic towards Lula, there have been pretty extreme measures taken against these insurrectionists and folks around them. It seems as though, much like the aftermath of the attempted coup against Erdogan, and to a much lesser extent in the United States, there was some expansion of surveillance and oversight of right-wing elements in the aftermath of January 6, 2021. It does seem as though, and I think this was the case even before January 8th, that there were elements in the Brazilian judiciary that are taking some pretty extreme measures against Bolsonaristas and others. Generally not a fan of that, but I think it's important for me to observe a distinction between what I'm not a fan of, and I should probably observe this in Turkey as well, where I am less sympathetic to Erdogan than I am to Lula. And to be clear, what's going on in Brazil is nowhere near on the scale of what has been going on in Turkey. But there just is not the same legal respect for free speech in the entire rest of the world that there is in the United States. There's a lot that goes on in the Brazilian judiciary system that I, as an American, find really uncomfortable making and really dislike. So I think looking at that, I do have to realize it's not my country, and there's different approaches to that sort of stuff. But if Glenn Greenwald, who was a big Lula supporter, is pissed off about the actions of this judge, and Greenwald does live in Brazil and does is a very serious free speech activist, then maybe there's something to it. I just can't speak, but I can't speak in detail as to whether it's truly gone beyond the pale or is a real problem. Because just what I've read, like just sort of New York Times coverage or whatnot, it's kind of like, I don't fucking know, that's sort of where I'm at right now. I think hopefully the amount of scrutiny that it's gotten will lead to a bit of a back off. My understanding is what was so troubling, I should be a little more detailed about this, was that the judge was going after a wide range of people for what they were saying, going after folks who had participated in uh, had sort of tweeted about insurrection, or not even insurrection, just tweeted in support of Bolsonaro in ways that were, basically taking really extreme anti-speech measures to defend democracy. And I think in some cases, even making those proceedings secret, which that's always a real red flag. Like the proceeding, if the government is going after a person, they should be able to talk about it. Like that's like FISA courts in the United States. That I find that really, really troubling. Yeah, but again, I just can't dive into it too much. I really like the idea that Joe Biden is meeting with Lula, and I think that it's probably unfair, but I think that Biden could sort of claim that he played a positive role in having the elections occur without any kind of pushback. This is in the Brazilian elections. Even though they were much closer than anyone expected, Bolsonaro did concede and conceded peacefully. And I think Biden can claim to have a little bit of credit because he was very visible, and in the days after the election saying, this is what has happened. Not that the U.S. has direct influence in Brazil or to that extent, but if Bolsonaro had had Trump in the White House and could have thought that he'd have had U.S. support for some kind of coup-like activity, then he would have been more likely to do it. So, and I also think it's positive that Lula and Biden, the heads of the two biggest countries in the Americas, right? Yeah, the highest population and physically largest, well, Canada's physically very large, countries in the Americas are meeting together. I think that's great. I think it's awesome that he's not imposing some kind of penalty on Lula for being vocal about an opinion that is held by much of the global South, which is that, in Lula being suspicious or dubious or critical of the U.S.'s stance in Ukraine, I think Brazil and Lula still, condemns Russia's invasion to some degree, but also argues that Ukraine and NATO have a lot of responsibility for what happened, which, perhaps worded in different ways and with different degrees is something I believe to be true. But I think it's good that Biden isn't seeking to penalize Lula for expressing this very widespread view of Brazilian people or of the global South more generally that I think Lula consciously sees himself as a representative of. I didn't know he was meeting separately with AOC and Bernie and all that. That's that totally open to the idea of progressive solidarity across political systems. I think we're definitely seeing conservative solidarity across political systems. Witness the incredible love fest for Hungary's Viktor Orban, or Netanyahu in Israel is a very right-wing figure who gets a lot of love from right-wing news and right-wing politicians in the United States. And there's probably other examples I'm forgetting about. Yeah, Nigel Farage, before Brexit was shown to be the massive failure it was sort of an international conservative cause celeb. So yeah, I think we're going to see more and more of that solidarity along political lines internationally. It's been a dynamic for over a century. As soon as, well, over 2 centuries, really. As soon as we started having representative democracies, there were affiliations and connections across national lines. The whole Mike Duncan's Extraordinary Revolutions podcast project, which he's just wrapped up, I spent 5 or 6 years chronicling a bunch of revolutions from the English Civil War and the American Revolution up to the Russian Revolution. It does a great job of sort of illustrating how there's always been connections internationally. We've gone a long way with the Russia panic in sort of towards criminalizing or making those connections look more sinister, but I don't think, hopefully we'll fall back from that. The trend is towards more unified world government, and we're going to just see, certainly that's the evolution of the European right wing has made this really obvious in recent decades. You can lament it, but I think it's something that's just going to keep happening. And I think it's probably not a bad thing. folks should be on board with similar stuff. Thoughts about the Libya-Italy $8 billion gas deal? Also, what's your opinion on Tripoli and Benghazi, even before other region countries, surprising many observers? Thanks, Rob. The Libya-Italy $8 billion gas deal, if it can plausibly, possibly lead to some kind of stabilization in that country, is a good thing. My fear is that Italy, and I'm having a complete brain fart. I can't remember. Italy was always more on the Tripoli side, right? Is Fadel here? He could correct me quickly. But I think, yeah. The problem with the deal is that it just sweetens the pot for whoever manages to wrest control of Libya. If the benefits of the Libya-Italy deal can be divided up in a way that provides goodies to all parts of the country and contributes to stability, then that's a good thing. If it doesn't, then it's not a good thing. That may have seemed just obvious, but what's my opinion about the CIA director? So yeah, William Burns visited Tripoli and Benghazi. I think to my and other folks' irritation, he treated Khalifa Haftar, the wannabe strongman who invaded Tripoli, invaded really the majority of Libya and attempted to take it over in 2019, and I think failed and gave up in 2020, or was it 2021? I can't remember. I was irritated to see Williams Burns take Khalifa Haftar as seriously as he did, visiting with him and what have you. But I think on balance, it's a very, very good thing. I think that William Burns is a fairly serious, or at least, well, yes, William Burns specifically, the figure, is a tremendously storied diplomat. I think he's been part of, that's his name, William Burns or Michael Burns? I'm sorry, let me Google that right now. Yeah, William Burns. So yeah, he's really storied. I mean, he's 66 years old, so he's had 40 years doing U.S. diplomacy, incredibly internationally respected. And I think it's actually a really cool thing to have such a well-respected diplomat in charge of the CIA. I think that's a really good Biden administration choice. So he can actually go around and he's sort of like a shadow, more subtle Secretary of State. Just by nature of who he is. Obviously, it's not low profile to send a CIA director anywhere, but nobody expects the CIA director to be giving press conferences, I guess. So he can sort of be a little more of a problem solver. And obviously, like Mike Pompeo or the torture lady, these were Trump's CIA directors, were never going to be that. But William Burns can be that. And I think that's a very interesting and clever thing that the Biden administration has done. So regardless, he's a really highly placed U.S. official, internationally trusted. Probably if this isn't always the case for a CIA director, even a cabinet head. If William Burns wants to get Biden's attention and believes it's serious enough to get Biden's attention, I would imagine. Whether he has to go through another layer of the Security Council or not, like it gets on Biden's desk. So I think William Burns is a great guy to have in that position, and to have such a highly placed, influential U.S. figure in Libya is really fucking good, because that's the great horror for Libya, is that the U.S. has paid almost no attention to Libya since we destroyed the place back in 2011. We're just like, well, this is pretty embarrassing. Let's just avoid it, and maybe it'll resolve itself. Or you get really, I believe Trump endorsed Haftar's invasion of the other side of the country in 2019 with a tweet or something, which was absurd. William Burns is an indicator that there may be some serious policymaking attention to Libya, and that would be very good. I'm never against. And that may sound strange. Like I am very against U.S. military intervention. I am never against U.S. diplomatic intervention. I've highlighted Armenia and Sudan as two places where I believe that U.S. diplomatic intervention has had somewhat positive. Obviously, the Abraham Accords obsession with Sudan is a really bad thing, but it has kept the junta in Sudan from being able to completely just execute all democratic elements and displace them. And I think what Libya has really needed and I think got to some extent in early 2021 through the influence of an American UN official. It just needs a little more international attention because it's just such a dumb free for all with the United States. What happened fundamentally in Libya over the past decade is that the United States was embarrassed, didn't want to look at it anymore, and just let all of U.S. allies, U.S. rivals, just play whatever little games they wanted to play there, with probably some U.S. defense elements who are kind of interested to use the place as like a drone workshop / showcase. So yeah, we just let it sort of slide away. So I think it's very good that a CIA official, that the leader, the CIA director, was visiting Libya, and hopefully we'll get some more effort towards resolution there. John asks, Rob, would you consider talking to political streamers to further boost your audience? People like Destiny and David Pacman come to mind. I'm not I think it's a little harder to get on those shows. But yeah, I'm, in theory, very open to collaborations. Please, if you have any good collaborations for suggestions for collaborations, just leave them in the comments, and I will look into them. Yeah, Scott Locke says 60,000 feet is damn impressive technologically. Yeah, these balloons are interesting. Local Stream says, honestly, seeing how international figures are choosing allegiance based on partisan lines really shows how bogus great power. That's a really great point. Yeah, yeah, I mean, U.S. politics is just progressively infiltrating everybody's politics. And the sort of more traditional partisan lines in all countries are conforming more and more towards U.S. partisan lines, and that's only a process. That's a process that's only going to continue. There's a lot of people who really oppose U.S. One world government, but it's kind of interesting that what I think we're going to end up getting is one world government that's just really an extension of U.S. government, which a little controversial, but. Thoughts on the U.S. warming up to the idea of giving F-16 to Ukraine? I'm not super excited about it. I haven't really thought a ton about it. But I do think that it's kind of inevitable that that Ukraine will be armed more and more heavily. As Ukraine demonstrates fitness, in February, it was at the beginning of March, when my and I think most people's assumptions was that Russia would very quickly conquer Ukraine. To be clear, I never thought they were going to be victorious in Ukraine. I thought that they were going to be able to pretty easily push Ukraine into a Western stub or hub while the Russians were worn down by massive insurgency in the parts that they managed to take. I didn't think it would ever be a victory for Russia, but I thought they'd be much more effective in wiping out the official Ukrainian military. So at that point, I was very, very steadfastly against providing any arms to Ukraine because of the escalation possibilities. Ukraine has demonstrated that it can survive and that it can maintain a really broad range of. It still kind of blows my mind that Russia was never able to establish air superiority in Ukraine. And it indicates that the fantasy that Russia is any kind of military competitor to the United States is just beyond laughable. It's amazing that people pretended that was a real thing for a while. It still blows my mind. I'm still angry about it to some extent. But now that Ukraine has demonstrated that it is a peer competitor to Russia, we should have a much wider. I'm comfortable with a much wider range of the provision of weapons. I think maybe I would like to see this transition to a point where Ukraine can actually afford to pay us for some of this stuff. But that's not going to happen anytime soon, and this conflict's probably going to last a decade. So I'm not super excited about Ukraine being given U.S. tanks and planes, but I'm also not particularly surprised by it. I have a lot of questions about, is this really the best thing that we should be giving them? Like, do they probably need more artillery rounds and less sexy and expensive stuff that we should be focusing on? Yeah, it's. I mean, of course, every new U.S. weapons platform we get there, we give them makes nuclear war more possible. But whatever. We've given up on caring about that, huh? I've said my piece on that. I can, if New York turns into a cinder, I can die happy knowing that I've got a number of videos talking about how that was a real possibility. Anyway, any more super chats? Anyway, let's see. Thoughts on NORAD exercises? I'm not sure. These NORAD exercises in relation to balloons or something. Not super. Not certain. Not certain I care. Oh no, sorry. I'm not certain I care. I was thinking about. Sorry, I was reading another comment there. No, obviously, whatever NORAD's doing is probably interesting to some degree. I'm just not aware of it. Don't have anything to say about it. Dax Inman, can you talk more about Brexit and if things will get any better for them sometime soon? So, Brexit, the idiots who did Brexit were reliant on the idea that the United States would swiftly scoop them up for some kind of free trade agreement, ignoring the fact that this really broad-based populist hatred of free trade agreements, like the European Union, was something that was also very much going on in the United States at the same time. So this idea that Donald Trump or Joe Biden would, rush to save Britain with a really generous free trade agreement has, proven to be fucking nonsense. And it's amazing that they thought that was something that was plausible or that would happen. It wasn't, and it didn't. So Britain is what's happening in Britain is largely what a lot of folks predicted. It's just slowly stagnating. Britain's economy, this was a conscious choice made by Thatcher and definitely her successors, Tony Blair, come to mind, was a conscious choice to make Britain's big deal be finance. And they successfully became the EU's financial hub in London. And that's collapsing. Because why the hell would the EU continue to submit to having all their banking hubs being in Britain? It's not a big bang. It's not a instant collapse. There's still a ton of banking professionals, really savvy folks in London, but they are trickling away. As the natural evolution of finance continues. Citibank closes a trading floor that isn't useful in London and opens whatever the digital successor of that is in Frankfurt or Paris. It's just so what you've got in the UK is stagnation. I think that was basically the only country. I'm not sure if this is true, but I certainly saw things to this effect that actually the only country with a worse economic forecast for 2023 than Russia is the United Kingdom. It's just an incredible own goal. I think that if the European Union persists, if the European Union figures out a number of things on its own account, a number of big things, to what degree are they actually going to have a real central currency? What degree are they, what are they going to do to figure out their demographics? There's a lot that the EU has to figure out, but if the EU figures a few of those things out, and still exists 10, 20 years from now, I think the chances of the UK submitting to rejoin are pretty high. And I think that they're going to continue. I don't know. The United States might decide that it's got a strategic interest in keeping Europe weak. And to do that, obviously signing a generous free trade agreement with the UK would be a good way to do that, which would remove the necessity for the United Kingdom to rejoin the EU to get any kind of economic weight or growth back. I don't know, but I'd say that the chances of, regardless, whatever happens, Brexit made them infinitely weaker. Yeah, Brexit made Britain infinitely weaker. Whether they end up signing up to a U.S. free trade agreement or rejoining the EU, it's going to be on much, much worse terms than their membership in the EU. I think that's something I can say with great confidence. Yeah. So, thoughts on America and Africa? Well, I've got a half hour produced video. If you just go over to the videos tab on my YouTube channel, you can see a half hour of agonized thinking about the U.S. presence in Africa. I don't like it. Specifically, I don't like the over-militarized aspect of it. The fact that our military is expected to do really everything in Africa. And I think that's really dumb. I think there's tremendous scope for the improvement of U.S. aid to Africa, U.S. humanitarian aid, more serious European diplomacy. Instead, we seem to mostly be spending money on creating militaries within these countries that mostly seem to be exerting themselves by coups, by taking over and destroying the governments of these countries, and I don't think that's worthwhile or smart. Local Cool Stream says, you've stated before that the MSM's Russiagate contributed to the war in Ukraine. Can you elaborate on that? Well, if the nominally half of the political scene of a given country, but honestly the much more influential part of a country, meaning sort of the media establishment, for lack of a better term, the liberal media establishment, which I think is a terrible misnomer. If the entire media establishment of a country, as well as one of the main political parties of the most powerful country in the world, go on a 6-year rampage of declaring that Russia is the enemy of all humanity and the United States specifically, that's going to encourage a country to believe there are no diplomatic alternatives, that physical invasion or conquest of a neighbor is the only way they're going to be able to get their interests honored. There were a number of processes, the Minsk I, Minsk II, the election of Zelensky, who sold himself as a very pro-Russia actor. These were all hopeful aspects, hopeful processes for the resolution of Russian and Ukrainian differences. The hijacking of that process, those processes, by United States insanity, the crazy schizophrenic 1-2 punch of Trump claiming, "Oh yeah, we're pals now. This is all going to be great. We're good. We're the best." With Russia, while at the same time, not just the U.S. Congress under Trump, but also the administration under Trump, that he nominally controlled as the commander-in-chief, was extremely more aggressive towards Russia than Obama was. And you've got MSNBC and CNN and the New York Times talking about how Russia is the enemy of all humanity, and et cetera, et cetera. I think I'm not saying, again, none of this exonerates Putin for his incredibly stupid and evil decision to walk into this trap that the U.S. had laid for him in Ukraine. But I do think it's ridiculous that we spend no time discussing the Russia hoax, the incredible McCarthyite push against Russia, or Trump's hijacking of Ukrainian politics to attempt to use it in presidential politics against Biden. Like we just don't talk about that at all. It's just, there was the 2014 invasion. One of the best questions somebody asked me about this recently was like, everybody acknowledges that in 2014, Russia could have, with the state of the Ukrainian military at that point, they probably could have marched on Kyiv. But in 2014, Russia still believed that there was a liberal world order, still believed that there was a chance through European and U.S. engagement, diplomatic engagement, there was a chance of getting its wishes respected, and actually, they thought, okay, maybe we just do this one violent thing and, show that what we're capable of, then okay, then we'll be able to negotiate things back and things will be okay. They still believe that in 2014. By 2022, by February of 2022, because of political developments worldwide and in the United States, they simply no longer believe that. And I think it's ridiculous that we don't focus on that at all, that we don't think about what happened in the United States and in the United States posture towards Russia between 2014 and 2022. We're just like, oh, Russia was evil, and they decided to do evil in 2014, and then they decided to do evil in 2022 again. Pay no attention to what the most powerful country in the world was doing during this period. I dislike that. I hope that was a decent answer. Chris Murtaugh says, yeah, thanks. Well, it's very kind. Thank you. Do you have a question, Christopher? Thanks for these videos, Rob. I really appreciate your insight and thoughtfulness. Well, that is very kind. Thank you. I'm grateful to be here, and grateful that there are most of 50 people who find it worth listening to. And I'm incredibly grateful to the patrons and to the folks who donate with these super chats to make it possible. And Christopher Murtaugh is both of those. I'm very grateful for him. So thank you, Christopher. Are you still skeptical about the EU? Yes, I'm very skeptical about the EU, but now I'm less skeptical than I used to be. So around Brexit times, I thought there was a real serious chance of the EU falling apart. I still think there's a real serious chance of the EU falling apart, but I am less concerned about that possibility than I was in 2016 with Brexit or the years directly thereafter. To be clear, I think the EU is in the midst of, is going to continue having a very difficult time. I don't think that things are going to, I think the demographic situation for Europe is pretty bad. I think that there's no question that the United States, I think, full Zihan, like, oh, the U.S. is going to withdraw, is clearly not happening. There's, now 100,000 U.S. troops in Europe for the first time since the Cold War. But in return for this real jacking up of U.S. defense commitments to Europe, it seems obvious that there's a lot less interest in bankrolling European industry than there used to be. So I think that not only is Europe going to have to deal with demographic challenges, they're also going to have to deal with the United States forcing German companies to build their factories in the United States instead of Europe. Not all of them, just, a higher percentage of them. And that on the margin is going to be crappier for Europe. Europe still, I think there's been a lot of hopeful stuff around COVID and even responses to Ukraine of sort of Europe acting in a more unified manner. There's still a lot of really central questions related to finance, the euro, and whatnot that have not been resolved and may never be resolved. So Europe still has a lot of massive challenges. But I do think that generations, not just a generation at this point, but generations of young people. I mean, young people is anybody younger than me now. So we're talking like all the millennials, all the Gen Zers. These are, as some demography people like to point out, these are smaller generations than they are in the United States, but they're real people there. We've got 30 years of the EU now. We've got 80 years since the start of the European coal and steel community. It's a real thing. The EU is a real thing. There's, I think, probably the majority of Europeans alive today are seriously committed to the EU continuing to be a thing. There may need to be some rollback of some EU regulations. There may need to be a reformatting of like the general political position in Brussels. Maybe even the euro needs to break up. That seems unlikely, but it might be something that has to happen. But I believe the EU will survive in some form. I think that seems very, very likely. So yeah, I am less pessimistic about the EU than I used to be, but wow, there are a lot of challenges. You still skeptical about the EU? Okay. Scott Locks, Tesla and Ford are both building EV plants in Mexico. Do you think NAFTA was positive? I have always thought NAFTA was positive. I thought NAFTA was great. As you may see, on Goodreads, I've got, and I just recently tweeted it, I read another Peter Zeihan book. I think I have to, because of the success of my last Peter Zeihan critique video, I think I have to do a new one. So I read his book. And it is interesting. There's a lot of things that Peter Zeihan says about U.S. power that I agree with. And I think that, which makes it so frustrating to me that he seems to not be willing to concede that like U.S. empire exists. And I think he doesn't quite, this idea that the U.S. is just going to withdraw, I think is farcical fantasy. But anyway, one of the aspects of U.S. power that he talks about that I find very persuasive is just how absurdly complementary Mexico and the United States are. Whereas, Mexico has a lot of benefits that the U.S. lacks. U.S. has a lot of benefits that Mexico lacks, and they work together amazingly well as a unit. NAFTA was a free trade agreement that was put in place in the mid-90s, I believe, and it was tremendously unfortunate for Mexico that this free trade agreement was put in place about 3 or 4 years before the U.S. accelerated its opening to China with the opening of with WTO accession. So I think there's a lot of people. I haven't checked in on this argument myself, but I think that a lot of folks. I think it's fairly well established, I could be wrong about this, that the massive flow of Mexican migration to the United States in the 90s and up until the great financial crisis was a result of NAFTA because Mexico couldn't handle the agricultural competition from the United States that NAFTA had unleashed. So the countryside essentially emptied. So there were a lot of negative consequences for Mexico from NAFTA that, and then a lot of the benefits that Mexico should have gotten from NAFTA were taken away were basically went to China instead of going to Mexico, which actually makes this era really, really hopeful for NAFTA because there are a lot of jobs being scraped out of China. And it's even certainly with the tariffs, but I've seen some folks writing claiming that it's actually cheaper to produce in Mexico even without the tariffs than it is in China now, just because Chinese standard of living has gone up so much. So yeah, I think this could be a really miraculously good time for NAFTA. And this was something that happened under Trump. The U.S. had a lot of complaints about NAFTA, and a lot of those complaints were addressed in a revision of NAFTA. I think they call it the USMCA, which is just very strange. It's like the U.S. Marine Corps. It's dumb use of acronym, but hey, the Trump administration, or Lighthizer to be more specific. What's he going to say? But yeah, I think the NAFTA unit, Canada, U.S., and Mexico, much bigger economy than the European Union at this point. There's a lot that's positive about that. And I think that scraping a lot of those jobs out of China and putting them in Mexico is going to be a very good thing. And hopefully might alleviate to some degree this drug nightmare we're dealing with. But we'll see. I hope the EU continues too, Daxtermin. Okay, so that's Fadal. If the coup hadn't happened, Egypt would be a far more serious country. Morsi had far more political weight and legitimacy than Sisi will ever have. No question. Just one of the most extraordinarily evil things ever. The coup. Well, the problem with the coup in Egypt is that it was supported by a lot of Egyptians. Morsi was not a good governor, but it would have been far, far better if folks had just waited for another election. And it probably would have been far, far better even if Morsi had stopped the next election. Because yes, he had vastly more political weight and legitimacy than Sisi does. Sisi's just Assad if he wasn't opposed by the United States. Sisi came to power and killed 1,000 people. Morsi died in prison. I don't know if it was as a result of neglect or outright abuse, but yeah. 2011, the U.S.-supported dictator fell, and Egypt had, for the first time, had a democratically elected president in 2012. Wasn't great at the job. It's an incredibly difficult job. He was certainly sabotaged at every turn by Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Israel. Um, and then there was a coup that took him out and massacred his supporters. Really sad thing. Really sad thing. Logo Stream asks, thoughts on the first person of color prime minister of the United Kingdom being a Hindu Tory? I don't know a ton about Rishi Sunak. Somebody saying he's more naturally Californian than he is British in some ways. I don't know. That's probably unfair, maybe a little bigoted. I apologize for that, I guess. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know enough about Rishi Sunak to talk about him. It's honestly UK politics are amusing. I'll always hear a lot about them because they are politics that happen to happen in English. There's a lot of funny tabloids. The sort of meme worlds can be close, and of course, British politics are so disastrous that they're amusing to follow. But Britain's just a lot less important than it used to be. It's a simple fact. So yeah, I should probably have a more firm opinion on Rishi Sunak, but I just don't. I just don't. Josh Byrne asks, why is the world so tense post-pandemic? I think, millions of people died. That'll make people tense. Also, our pandemic response was universally pretty crap. I don't think anybody is really that psyched about how their government handled things. I think that we tried to do an international response in a more intense way than we ever had before, and found that our governments were not equal to the task, almost universally, especially our most powerful governments, China and the United States. So yeah, it's depressing and it's sad, and and you'd hope that there'd be impetus towards rebuilding and making things better, but I'm not seeing a ton of it. So I don't know. Maltemeyer says Sunak is the third European head of government of Indian descent. What a glorious time we live in. There was an Irish guy. Who was the other one? I can't remember. Scott Locke says NAFTA started January 1st, 1994. Military. Wow. Fadel says that the military did pay, this is in Egypt again, the military did pay a lot of protesters. Morsi had formed a new coalition with the Nasserists, and they had announced early elections. Wow. That would have been nice if that had happened. Logan says, joking, I'm sure, soon all of Europe will pay for what it did to India. Find that unlikely. I think Europe's about to pay for a lot of things, but I don't think it has much to do with what it did to India. Scott Locks, Mexican countryside is empty. I was working in Mexico from 1986 to the 1990s. So do we have questions? So yeah, if you guys are enjoying this, I would encourage you, I'm just going to spiel a little. I'm not seeing a ton of questions. If you guys are enjoying this, I would encourage you to sign up as a patron. There's a link to that in the description. There are 2 other presentations that are done just for the patrons every month. We do something like this, except it's a news brief. I look into everything that the patrons suggest, maybe putting like 20 minutes, half hour of research into the items, and then I go through them. It's a live chat like this, but only really 5 to 10 people attend, so it's an ongoing conversation. I read every comment. That might not be true forever, but that's true now. And that's available live, and it's also available through Patreon for as long as folks want to watch that. Also, there's a Discord server that's for patrons only that is great. It's sort of ongoing political conversation. I sort of haven't been as active on it as I like to be over the past 2 weeks. So sort of in Puerto Rico, but on a semi-vacation. But yeah, that's great. And once a month, we do like a Zoom chat. I don't prepare anything for it. It's just an opportunity to see the voices and hear the faces. Wait, see the faces and hear the voices of the folks that support the channel. So yeah, that's another benefit of signing up on Patreon. I would highly recommend that. That'd be great. Anyway, that's that pitch. Huh, interesting. James Parker says, I don't know if it's still the case, but back in 2011, there was a serious cult of personality around the military in Egypt. I read Bassem Youssef's biography, and it struck me how universal it seemed. Well, Bassem Youssef, what an interesting figure. This is a guy who was sort of became celebrated in the United States as sort of the Egyptian Jon Stewart or something like that. And then I think he more or less supported Sisi's coup because he was so anti-Morsi, and then quickly found that he was not allowed to do his satire work anymore after Morsi was gone. But yeah, it's fascinating. Is TikTok still on the chopping block? I think TikTok is still on the chopping block. It's been nice to see, though, over the past couple days. It had been... I had been to a point on TikTok where I was getting hundreds of thousands, well, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of views on every video. And then it went down to like hundreds of views. So it was like TikTok just stopped working for me. In last past couple of days, it seems to have come back, which is nice. It is no longer ignoring me. People are watching the, yeah, I uploaded something this morning, got 1,000 views so far. That's, and seems to have come back for me. So TikTok's working for me again, which is nice. Is TikTok going to get banned in the United States? I'd say the chances are pretty high. I don't know if it's like, well, maybe it's still 50-50, but yeah, there's a real possibility. Christopher Mertau says he's been missing the Patreon streams because of his move to Mexico. Definitely hope to attend the next. I hope to see you there. I think, yeah, I'm pretty sure we're doing the Zoom chat on Sunday. This Sunday, we do the Zoom chat where we just sort of hang out. And then the following Saturday, we'll do the Patrons Only newscast for February. I hope it's still February at that point. Yes, it'll still be February at that point. Yeah. Sisi's best argument for why the Gulf should continue to support him, this is the Egyptian dictator, is that a democratic Egypt would completely change regional dynamics. It really would have. It really would have been so much better if Morsi had continued in power. And you know what? Like, it's also like by taking him out, they turned him into a martyr. Like, I remember watching Morsi, and I know that a lot of this was filtered through anti-Morsi elements in international media, everybody, but like, he wasn't like awesome. It was a really hard job, and he wasn't doing it well. Like, if he had just flailed in it for another 2 years and like lost an election, Egypt and the world would be a much better place. Instead, he's a martyr. Thoughts on recent AI developments? RA, legal profession, U.S. politics, international relations. I think they're a little blown out of proportion. I think the ChatGPT is fun, but it's not that cool. I think that intellectual property and just a sort of general, like, do no harm algorithm managing is going to slow down a lot of these AI and these independent AI things. So what's going to end up happening is instead of these massive disruptions we're hoping to see, we're going to see a lot of these innovations move in-house into the big five folks. So what is it, the big five? Not even big five tech companies, sort of Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, and I guess we still count Facebook, though I finally sold all my Facebook stock after almost 15 years recently. Yeah, I don't know. I'm talking fairly smart guy the past couple of weeks who sort of said that, yeah, man, fusion plus AI is going to change everything. Singularity's coming. Entirely possible. Entirely possible. Life continues to change all the time, and it continues to change faster. I don't know. I'm not much of a tech prognosticator. I haven't put a ton of thought into it. I bought an O'Reilly book. This is 6 months ago on generative AI. So I thought it was so interesting, and I made it 8 pages into it and was completely defeated by the math. But who knows? Maybe I'll make it to page 10 today now that somebody's mentioned it. Okay, down to the last 15 minutes here. Any last chance questions? Anything? Anything at all? Yeah, I think Fadl, that's exactly right. I'm not a fan of Morsi, but dying in prison has made him a hero for democratic aspirations, as is natural. Um, well, yes, the U.S. lifting sanctions on Iraq in 2003 would have completely changed regional dynamics. Yes, that would have made a difference. I spent 3 hours playing out an alien invasion scenario with an AI yesterday. I have no regrets. It was fun. So that was what, on ChatGPT, or like a more involved video game type thing? It's funny. I was watching this on TikTok. I was watching a video with Nick Offerman, the guy from Parks and Rec, the guy who played Ron Swanson, who's actually recently he was in that really affecting episode of The Last of Us that I saw recently, about the gay couple in the zombie apocalypse. Anyway, Nick Offerman talking about how he had spent 2 weeks playing a video game 25 years ago, and 25 years playing a video game, he spent 2 weeks playing a video game 25 years ago and decided he would just never play a video game again because it would like eaten up so much time. And that's actually been my approach to a lot of stuff. I just don't play video games. I had a real Age of Empires problem back in college, and I just stopped after that. But it was also interesting to think about that actually, like, what I was doing at that point, like playing on TikTok, trying to post my own stuff, is also just kind of a video game, you know? So, like, maybe the AI thing does just sort of move things forward into just the complete conquest of our time by digital services. And I think what James is talking about here is kind of an example of that. Though I'll confess, I have no idea what a character AI is. Football 42 says Zihan is very pessimistic of China's future. Insight. So Zihan's really pessimistic about China's future and really optimistic about America's future, and I kind of agree to an extent on both of those things, but to a much smaller extent. I don't believe the U.S. is going to withdraw at all, and I don't believe that. I just read this book. Like, Zihan flat out says half of China is going to starve to death by the end of this decade. That's his actual forecast. Like, you know, or maybe things will go better, but like he seems to really believe that half of China is going to starve to death by the end of this decade. I don't believe that. I believe that absolutely China has a lot of problems. I believe that the sort of standard, oh, China's terrifying, they're about to take everything over, is nonsense. I do believe that China's going to continue to fail and fail miserably under Xi Jinping specifically, and I think probably under the Chinese Communist Party more generally. But I also believe that China's going to come out on the other side of this, not having seen half of the people in the country die, with quite possibly a much more powerful and effective system. This idea that China's going to disappear, Zihan uses language like that, is absurd to me. They have serious challenges, incredible challenges, and a crisis coming. But I think they'll come out on the other side of it stronger, and I do believe that the second half of the 21st century, not the first half, I agree with Zihan on that, but the second half of the 21st century could end up being about competition between China and the United States. Local extreme. Why is China unable to create a U.S.-style consumer market? This gets a little outside of my wheelhouse. I've read a lot of economic analyses that talk about this. China has promised for a couple decades now, or at least a decade at this point, that it's going to shift from more of an investment-led market to more of a consumer-led market, more like the United States. Investment, when you have a lot of things you need to invest in, is really effective way of supercharging your economy. The problem is that China has run out of things to invest in. They have built out the high-speed rail. They've built out all the cities they need. They've built out all the highways they need. The whole point of Belt and Road was to just find something else for their construction industries to do to an extent. And yeah, like that's just sort of a dead end. At a certain point, you're building bridges nobody needs. You're building high-speed rail that nobody needs. And that's the point at which the Chinese have arrived at. So you get to, and economists claim to actually be able to calculate this. You can say that like the third bridge is in that, the third bridge on the same highway is that much less useful for investment. So what the Chinese have to do, know they have to do, acknowledge they have to do, have been saying they have to do for a decade now, is switch to a more consumption-led, where like actually instead of government and big businesses taking most of the wealth, the consumers need to get more of the wealth and then generate a more higher-powered consumer economy. Because of course it's the consumer economies of the United States and to a lesser extent Europe that have built the Chinese miracle. What Chinese needs to do is bring that consumption in-house. The problem is it's easier said than done, and the distortions of switching are the real problem. As part of this investment focus, the main way that folks plan for retirement, build wealth, what have you, in China is real estate investment. So the real estate market is incredibly bloated and overvalued. And as an attempt, as part of this healthy shift, they've needed to de-emphasize real estate, and they've tried to de-emphasize real estate repeatedly. And whenever they do, they get destabilizing looking Chinese real estate market crashes, like Evergrande. Remember Evergrande? We talked about that a lot. And they have to back off. So every time they make a switch that they would need to make towards not just a more consumption-led economy, but like a more open currency, anytime they make that switch, things get a little destabilizing and the Chinese Communist Party gets worried and they have to go back on it. So yeah, that's my understanding of how that works. Gabriel Durd says, forget how long you mentioned having lived in New York City, but any thoughts on the long-term prospects for the city? I worry about New York City's long-term prospects, frankly. It's the largest city in the United States, continues to be. 20 years ago, when I was in high school, it was also kind of the capital of the U.S. economy. Like, it was real important. Anything that was important, maybe not 20 years ago, but 40 years ago for sure. New York had hegemonic power over culture and industry and business in the United States, and I've just watched that slowly fade. Silicon Valley is a lot more important, infinitely more important for U.S. industry and business. Finance is still mostly here, of course. Media is still mostly here, of course, but a lot of those old media giants are sort of on their last legs. New York, because of its concentration of people, will continue to be and just historic legacies, will continue to be a very interesting place to be. But I do worry that it's losing a lot of its cachet to California to an extent, but I think to a progressively more disturbing extent to Washington, D.C. When I moved to Washington, D.C. in 2003, living there was not a fraction, but significantly less than it cost to live in New York. Now, in some neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., those costs are becoming similar. Remote work is kicking New York's ass. There's a lot of office space in downtown Manhattan that is kind of vacant and may never be filled. People are talking about turning it into residential space. It's still going to continue to be an exciting place to live for my lifetime. People are going to want to live here for my lifetime. But in long-term trends, yeah, I do kind of worry that New York has like a future as like a Lyon or like what's another example? A city that used to be a big deal. I'm sure China's got 300 examples of cities that used to be a much bigger deal that aren't anymore. So I worry about that. But as far as like, the rest of my life, I think New York will continue to be a big deal. I think New York City politics and New York politics in general are in desperate need of being shaken up. The Democratic governance here kind of sucks. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if that was particularly helpful. What do you think about Andrew Tate? I have no idea who Andrew Tate is. I just never knew. He'd like got in a tweet storm with Greta Thunberg and yeah, and he's got arrested in Romania. Is he like a UFC fighter or something? I have no idea who that is. Well, remote work is what is allowing me to not experience snow in February. I love it. Oh, I didn't realize that. So, Christopher, you are a remote working refugee or transplant. That's fascinating. So for some reason, I am not allowed to send a super chat for less than $10 now. I'm heartbroken. No, yeah, I don't. That was not a setting that I chose, Scott. Sorry about that. Is that been other people's experience? I think I got a $2 super chat earlier, $5. Yeah, that's strange. Let's see, Andrew Tate. Yeah, I don't know who Andrew Tate is. I think I tried Googling him a couple times, and I was just like, I still don't get it. This doesn't make sense to me. Digital nomads. Yes, that's a much better way to put it than remote working refugees, RMRs. Yeah. I think it is fascinating. Just like what it continues to be fascinating. Just like what the ramifications of this pandemic are. Yeah. I mean, I do think it's shifting. So I go down to Puerto Rico a lot, visit my sister. She's like a tech person. She's got a bunch of tech friends. And like, I think, so I go down there pretty much every February. And I do feel like people were able to live and work down there, but they were able to live and work down there for shorter and shorter periods of time, if that makes any sense. So I do wonder if, the remote work thing can become less of a thing than it was during 2020, obviously, but could still be a massive transition for the world economy, and I think that's what we're seeing. Andrew Tate is the real life personification of Tom Cruise's character from Magnolia. That's funny. I'm not going to tell that story, but yeah. I have a funny story about that movie. Interesting. In the line for super chat. Yes, I don't know what the deal is with the super chat mystery, but yeah, we are at 1:59, so we're at about the 2-hour mark. It will definitely take a super chat to keep me talking. My name is Robert Morris. I upload on the channel frequently. I tend to do daily super chats. I just don't do it weekly anymore. But there's an incredible wealth of things to be watched on the video column. 8 years of my life doing political analysis here. I think I let out of the bag that I'm going to do another Zion critique. I need to write that the next couple days. Would love to get that out next Tuesday, but making no guarantees. If you sign up for Patreon, you can join us on Sunday for the sort of Zoom chat, or what I call it, on our Discord server. Our patrons-only Discord server is also pretty awesome. Sign up on Patreon. I am on Instagram as the More Freedom Foundation. I am on TikTok as the More Freedom Foundation. I am on YouTube, confusingly, as the Mo Freedom Foundation, because they have fewer characters available there. I'm on Twitter at RoboLaw. You should check me out there, as long as there continues to be a Twitter. I think the site has really been finally falling apart a fair amount over the past couple weeks. I've also written a couple books. Avoiding the British Empire is the most recent one, talking about how the United States is making many very similar mistakes to the British Empire, which ended in a couple world wars, and we should probably avoid that. I've also got a podcast now, the More Freedom Foundation podcast, which is available on all podcast platforms. It's a lot of fun. Chatting with Rory. I do that every week now. I do the daily shorts on YouTube. They're usually first on YouTube, and then I tend to upload them later on TikTok and Instagram. What am I missing? Am I missing something here? that logo was kind enough to enter my Twitter handle there at RoboLaw. Yeah. Any last super chats? Regardless, this has been great. Oh, another super chat. Why vacation in Puerto Rico? Why not Mexico? Places like Oaxaca are real Latin America. I think going to Puerto Rico may skew your view of Latin America. Oh, no question. I just go to visit my sister. My sister lives in Puerto Rico. I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is also the United States. Therefore, it has some more, what's the word? Is more interesting to sort of tech workers like my sister and her friends. And honestly, to be clear, I mostly go down to hang out with my sister because she's pretty cool and she has a lot of cool, fun friends. You know, it makes me feel younger. Hang out with my baby sister and her cool, fun friends. That's why vacation in PR. I do want to see more of Latin America for sure. I think that's definitely something I need to do. It's embarrassing to me. I've never been to Argentina or Chile. I feel like I should do that trip at some point, though it's probably not going to be this year. Let's see. All right. Yep. I think eventually I'm probably going to try and go back to weekly production with videos, but I don't know, man. The produced videos I have to do are pretty long. At this point, I'm trying to write another book called American Empire: The First 100 Years. So yeah. All right. Yes, you can bully Rob in person on the Discord. That's one fun thing about it. All right, y'all are the best, and thank you for keeping this channel going. Have a lovely day. Well, should I talk more about Mexico or Oaxaca? I feel like this was a super chat. Have you seen the train in Ohio? I've not seen it personally. I've seen the news. Why vacation in Puerto Rico? Why not Mexico? Places like Oaxaca are real Latin America. I think going to PR may... Yeah, there's no question going to Puerto Rico skews one's view of Latin America. I think that's very true. It is part of the United States, after all. You think this is the best time for Arab? I don't think the Arabs are getting Jerusalem back. Not in our lifetimes, honestly. Yeah, I don't think. I have very little hopeful to say about the cause of Palestine, which makes the bad empanada very, very angry and comments on my videos. Anyway, yeah. All right. Thanks so much. Y'all are the best, and have a lovely day.